I have a few different and specific thoughts about The Wolf Den, so I thought I'd put them together in a little numbered list. I am going to start with one thing that I really liked about the book, one thing that didn't really sit right with me, and then 3 other things that I also really liked, because mostly I loved this book. If you haven't read it or haven't heard of it, The Wolf Den by Elodie Harper is a piece of historical fiction set in Pompeii just after little baby Jesus was born, and then also died. Right? I don't know much about Jesus. The titular Wolf Den is a brothel, and our protagonist is a sex worker slave who works at this brothel. Is work the right word? Well, she's a slave to the brothel. And all of the other characters are her owner, her fellow sisters who also work at the brothel, and clients that come along. Our protagonist is called Amara, and she has a very tragic backstory. She was the daughter of a very successful doctor in Greece. Unfortunately, he was really kind to his clients, and he didn't always charge them the money that he had to charge them. And that eventually led to him getting into debt, and then he died, and then his family had no money, and so she was sold. She's a very educated young woman, but she has been sold into slavery as a sex worker at this wolf den, and her life ever since has been tragic. But I won't say any more, because actually that leads into one of my points. So, let me start with one thing that I really loved about this book, and that is sisterhood. The women that work at the wolf den are all people from different backgrounds. Some of these women come from very different worlds to one another, but they are all sisters. Sisterhood is the crux of this novel. Most strikingly between Amara and her best friend at the brothel, Dido. The sisterhood in this book is so inspiring. The way that they laugh in the face of such tragic and awful things. Every single day, these women are made to do whatever their clients want them to do. And of course, they hate it. But they do manage to laugh. They do manage to make fun. There are moments where they are outside the brothel, walking the streets of Pompeii, laughing and joking. They go to a festival, and they even manage to sort of build a new life as they realize there are other things that they can do. Their manager is a guy called Felix. He owns these women, and he's business savvy to a point. And later on you find out that there's actually a bit of tragedy in his story as well. Not that I wanted him to be sympathetic, but when you do get that, it does kind of feel nice somehow. Even though I didn't need it at all, he's a villain. But because he's very business savvy, he allows Amara occasionally to come to him with ideas. And her sisters are more than willing to kind of go along, at least some of them, with her ideas and try to build a better life or build a better situation within this life and do more things for money other than just sex work. And the fact that they all come together in support of one another is always really lovely. There's also a lot of tragedy. Some of them are sick, they might get pregnant, they might get cast out, they might get injured. And if they are injured, especially in their face, then they are worthless and they might get sold or just cast away. And there's so much tragedy, but they continue to be sisters. Their bond remains incredibly strong all the way through the book, and that bond between them as you get to know all their different personalities, their strengths, their weaknesses, the way that they laugh, the way that they joke together, it's all so inspiring, and I'm gonna kind of come back to that in a second. But the one thing I didn't like about this book, or at least something that just didn't sit right with me about The Wolf Den, is classism. Now, I'm not super confident in this, it's just something that rubbed me the wrong way personally. As I said, Amara is uniquely intelligent. She was raised by a doctor, she can speak multiple languages, she can read and write, she has knowledge of medicine and philosophy, and she's our protagonist. She's the one who's going to try and crawl out of this situation, crawl out of this life. But the others, the other girls, who, in spite of their, as I said, sisterhood and camaraderie, they feel a little bit more cursed to remain in this situation because they weren't born into a world that allowed them the opportunity to read and write and learn languages and study under a doctor. So it feels a little classist, the idea that Amara is the only one who has any hope of escaping and using her savvy to climb out of this world purely because at one point she was born into a much higher class. Now she's a sister in this wolf den. They're all on equal footing. But because of her past, because of her childhood, there's this sense of kind of nepotism. There is a sense of nepotism to Amara as a character. She knows the right people, or at least she did. She had the right opportunities before coming into the Wolf Den, and that has equipped her to climb out. The rest of them, it just wouldn't work. She has to be our protagonist because she's the only one with any hope. And it kind of teaches you that nepotism is very, very important. You need to make sure that you know the right people, that you get educated in the right places, all of this stuff. And nepotism is a horrible thing. So that's the one thing that just rubbed me the wrong way when it comes to this book. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I read that wrong. Maybe I am philosophically interpreting it entirely poorly, and you can tell me and you can call me out in the comments and let me know whether you just disagree with that. But also, if you love nepotism, go away. Now, the next thing that I loved about it is the way that it positively depicts sex workers. Its entire premise and setting and characters, everything is about sex workers. The Wolf Den is a brothel, and our protagonists are sex workers. Now, in the society we currently live in the society that I grew up in, the society all of us grew up in, sex workers are looked down on. Sex work is not work, people say. We use the words that we describe sex workers with as slurs, as insults. This is a thing that has gone on for centuries. But the Wolf Den turns these sex workers into real people because they are. And it validates sex work. Even though these people are slaves, what it does is it validates their lives, their right to live, their right to laugh and enjoy themselves, to be sisters, to be friends, to be human. It reinforces the fact that sex work is hard, sex work is valid, even though, of course, these people are slaves and they're not choosing this. But in the bigger, broader picture, it turns sex workers into people who make you laugh, people who make you cry. It is humanizing. And in this society, we need that. And I hope that none of this comes across as patronizing to sex workers. That's not my goal. It's just pointing out that sex work is always something that's looked down on, patronized, belittled, dehumanized. And the Wolf Den does a really good job of reversing all of that. It's just nice to have an entire group of protagonists that are all sex workers, and they're all very, very different people, and they all have disparate personalities and goals and pasts and futures, etc. It's lovely to see. How often do you see a book where the entire cast of characters are sex workers? It's awesome. Now, I love historical fiction. I really, really do. It's one of my favorite genres, and I'm thrilled to see a piece of historical fiction that's set in a place that doesn't exist anymore. Pompeii is gone. It's also a piece of historical fiction, as I've said, about sex workers. That is a very unique thing. And the fact that it's a piece of historical fiction by a woman writer about women and about women's place. It's an incredibly feminist novel. But all of that aside, the setting itself is just very electric. The way that the Wolf Den itself is described, the way that Pompeii comes to life, the fashion and the food and the festivals, the traditions, the way that people behave, it's all very, very rich, and you really feel it. There are very specific things that happen in this story that were unique festivals or celebrations or specific days that only happened at this time in this place, and it really, really puts you in there. Sometimes historical fiction could have been put anywhere. Sometimes you'll read an historical novel, and it didn't have to be historical. It didn't have to be set in that specific place. Maybe it's set in London. Maybe it's set in Athens, and you feel like, well, it didn't really have to. And you can argue that here because the language is modern. These women are not speaking in any specific dialect or using any specific language. They talk like modern British women. That aside, the Pompeii setting is still just visually and aesthetically very delightful. It's very organic and it feels very full of life. The characters that you meet help expand that world. For example, later in the book, you meet Pliny. Pliny. He is a character in this book. That's really, really cool. I loved seeing that. And I love the way that he was depicted and his relationship to Amara. It was really cool seeing him pop up. And although it felt a little bit like in those old Assassin's Creed games where suddenly Da Vinci pops up and builds you a raft or whatever the fuck, it felt a little like that. I still can't deny I enjoyed it. You can argue it's fan service, but it was fun. And Pliny aside, Pompeii just felt like a really lived in and understood and three-dimensional place that I just wanted to stay in. And the final thing I loved was the protagonist herself. As I said, the nepotism reading that I had of this book kind of rubbed me the wrong way, but Amara is still a wonderful character to follow as the book goes on. As you learn more about her past and her tragedies, as you learn about her savvy and her business mind and her tenacity and her relationship to the other women, she is a hugely likable character, in spite of that nepotism thing. But that's not really about her, that's about the author's choices. As a character, I really didn't want to leave her side. I found myself enjoying her and enjoying the other characters as well. All of the women in the Wolf Den are really, really interesting in their own way. And Elodie Harper does such a good job of differentiating these women. In the first few chapters, you're hit with a lot of different names, and they are all sex workers in the same building, talking over each other, and you're like, sorry, who is who exactly? It's kind of like the first episode of Derry Girls. You meet all of these girls and they're all shouting over each other, but eventually you get to know all of their characters and their personalities and their likes and dislikes and their histories, and you really bond with them, but none as strongly as Amara, the protagonist. She's not overshone or overshadowed by anybody else. She remains a protagonist that you are just glued to, even though in very typical protag fashion, she is the least interesting one in terms of the way that she kind of talks and moves, and she's the most subdued and quiet and chill one. I'm watching a spider. Is it gonna move? Oh my god, it's moving. Oh, it's getting on my jumper. Alright, come here. Okay, I didn't kill it. Don't kill spiders. So Amara is a protagonist that isn't all that interesting compared to the others, which is so often the case when you have a large cast of characters. You'll have the funny one, you'll have the brash one, you'll have the stupid one. And you get all of that here. It's very archetypical. But Amara remains interesting in spite of that. In spite of not being the loudest and funniest one, she's the most intelligent. And she's the most savvy, and therefore you magnetize towards her brain and her ambitions and what you think is going to happen next. And also just her love for her sisters, and her love for herself. And the fact that actually maybe she is capable and willing to screw over her sisters, maybe. You're going to have to keep watching to find out. And I love that. It really glued me to her and her journey. And I found her very engrossing for that reason. There's a lot to like about her, and just this feeling that maybe you should dislike her, or you might have to at some point, and that's a lot of fun. Overall, The Wolf Den is just such a fun and engaging read. It's sad and it's full of tragedy, but it's also funny at times. It doesn't ever bog you down too much in the tragedy of the thing. It gives these sex workers so much life and vibrancy and humour and comedy, while also really, really peeling back your eyes to make sure that you're looking at the tragedy of the whole thing and the pain that the power of patriarchy has. It's a very feminist book for that reason, but it doesn't kill you with its tragedy. It reminds you that in the face of patriarchy and masculine oppression, women can still laugh and women can still win and come out on top. And the fact that these women are sex workers from 2,000 years ago is very uplifting. There's a lot to really like about this, but please let me know in the comments what you think about the whole nepotism thing, because I'm very curious. Subscribe for books.